Welcome to Finding Home Healing. I'm your host, Sadie. I believe you were born with a light that guides you to your higher self and most passionate life. But for many of us, it's been extinguished or lost. My mission is to help you find your way back home to that light so that you can love deeper, live in your power, and truly thrive. For those lost or lonely souls, welcome home. Welcome to this episode of Finding Home Healing. If you are a lost or lonely soul spiritually, then this episode is going to be the perfect starting place for you. I am going to introduce you to an idea called belief buckets that you may or may not have any context or experience of, and help you understand what bucket you may fit into. So what is a belief bucket, Sadie? Well, according to most people, or if you ask a lot of people, despite what they would all say, that there's either a religious person, a spiritual, like a generally spiritual person, a secularized person, or an atheist, there are actually 6 distinct belief buckets. That those are some of them, 3 of them particularly, but there's 3 that don't fit into any of those categories. And these 3 buckets, you might not have ever even realized they existed, but you might actually fall into one of them. These 3 rarely discussed belief buckets are what I usually find most people that call themselves lost and lonely, or that maybe resonate with that idea of feeling lost or lonely, fit into. And it can sometimes explain why. Whatever bucket you might fit into, whether it's one of these 3 rarely discussed ones, it might explain why you feel lost and lonely and what steps you can take in order to feel more connected and loved. It's my passion to help people that fit into one of these 3 more rarely discussed buckets, because at one point I was in each one of them personally. If you think that you fit into any of these 3 buckets, this podcast is going to really help you feel more seen, understood, and supported. Okay, so let's dive into these buckets. The first 3, like I said, are generally ones that people know about. The first one is a believer. You might be a believer, or you might have heard people talk about believers. These are either religious believers or spiritual believers. And I want to be very clear that the Christian faith, like the non-denominational Christian faith, they use this term a lot. And I'm using the term in relation to how they also use the term, but also in a little bit of different context, where it doesn't necessarily mean that a believer is somebody who believes in Jesus Christ and that he died on the cross to save them and, his blood washed away their sins and all of that. That's what the non-denominational people in church would consider a believer. But I'm referring to a believer as someone just generally who has a pretty solid belief system. They either have a religion that they feel really congruent with, they have a belief system that really works for them and that feels fulfilling, it feels true, it feels really good, and it fills them up, and they're good. Like, they don't have any questions or qualms or doubts or anything. They are solid, they are grounded, rooted, and fully with no doubt about their belief system. I really admire these people, because even if I don't agree with their beliefs, or if I don't have their beliefs, I still really deeply admire their solidity. And a lot of times they have an energetic field or a picture, when I can read their energy if they allow me to, that is very solid. And most people that I know that have this type of energy from a Christian perspective, they've been people that I really, really look up to and that I've deeply admired, and that I have strived to become more like them. As you learn more about me, if you listen to more of my podcast, you'll learn that I am a very, very curious mind, and I've always questioned everything, and I've questioned the system, and I've questioned this, that, and the other. So it's been a little harder for me to find that super congruent, like, this is exactly what I believe and this is what I am 100% congruent with and will die for type of belief system. But those that have that, truly and deeply admire them. I'm also referring to believers here in this context as those who have a spiritual belief. It doesn't necessarily have to be religious. It doesn't have to be Christian or Jewish or Hindu, Buddhist, Islamic. It could also just be spiritual, that they have a really solid and rooted, grounded spiritual belief. It could be that they believe that God is electricity and it's energy that flows through every person. It could be that they, believe in an ancient culture's spiritual doctrines, right? Like one of the people that I also admire the most, he has been one of my teachers. Oh, actually, now that I think of it, there's two that come to mind. And they are so rooted and solid and grounded in their belief system as a believer that isn't Christian or Jewish or Islamic or all of those other religious ideas. So you can be a believer in either a religious or a spiritual context or in some other type of context that you just have this experience of being really complete. Like there's not a lot of questions, there's not a lot of doubt, not a lot of feeling of loneliness or feeling lost. Okay? And then we go to the complete opposite of that, which would be non-believers. Well, I guess the complete opposite would be the third one that I'll discuss, but whatever. The next bucket would be what I call non-believers. Another word for this would be like secularized. A non-believer person is somebody who doesn't have a belief that there's nothing. That's our next category. But they just don't have any really solid or congruent like belief system. Like the definition of secularized, I actually have that here, and that was really helpful. I looked it up because I'm like, what do you actually define a secularized person as? It's someone whose beliefs, behaviors, or lifestyle are not influenced by religion or religious practices. This person may have been influenced by a secular environment, one that prioritizes non-religious, worldly concerns over spiritual or religious matters. Secularization often implies a shift away from religious values and institutions towards a more rational, scientific, or humanistic approach to life. A secularized person might still hold spiritual beliefs, but typically does not adhere strictly to religious doctrines or rituals. So if you're somebody who resonates with that message, I would call you a secularized person or a non-believer, not as an insult. That's just for our conversation and sake of helping those place themselves in different categories. That's where I would put you in your bucket. This like non-believer secularized bucket, there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. I have no judgment of people who would fit into this bucket. I do find that if I work with somebody who is in this bucket and they crave something more or something different, they actually fit into a different bucket that I will talk about in a little bit, one of those 3 more rarely discussed buckets. And but if you're happy just being a non-believer and more secularized, and you don't really have a draw or a call to have a spiritual practice or to be connected to a higher power or more deeply connected to yourself in a spiritual way, totally cool, no judgment. Those types of people would fit into this bucket. Okay, and the third one that most people would probably know about or recognize is called atheist. These people have a distinct belief in the fact that there's nothing to believe in. My grandfather was actually what I would call kind of an atheist. He just kind of believed that there was nothing more than your physical body, and when you died, you get buried in the ground and everything's over and done. The people that fit into this bucket, I typically don't really speak to. In the sense of like my messaging, I obviously speak to them. One of my clients is actually more in this bucket than anything. There's a distinct difference between like an atheist and a secularized person, where an atheist has a belief system that there is nothing. Like they're not super aloof. They're not like, I don't really know. Maybe there's something, maybe there's not. An atheist would like vehemently stand for their beliefs that there is nothing. And if you want to watch, any debates with like Jordan Peterson and some of the more atheist people that he's debated before, it's really, really interesting to watch and hear how their conversations develop and everything. So those are the 3 buckets that most people have an idea about and would be able to know and have some association to. The next 3 buckets are ones that almost no one talks about, and that, in my opinion, are such an underrepresented group of people that create this lost and lonely soul situation. And like I said earlier, I love getting to support people in these 3 buckets. It is my passion because I have been there myself, and it's really hard to be in one of these next 3 buckets I'm going to explain to you. It feels very like disconnected. And the whole point of this podcast is to help bring those lost and lonely souls back home to the power within themselves and the love and the light within themselves. Most of the time, the people that fit into these 3 buckets I'm going to describe to you have a disconnect from that place of home inside themselves, from that place of power and love and stability, security, comfort, all of those things. And that can manifest in lots of different ways. It can manifest psychologically with, mental emotional imbalances. It can manifest in relationship with insecure attachment styles. It can manifest in career and feeling really like low self-worth, low self-esteem, low confidence, not stepping into power or into purpose and passion. So there's a lot of impact that being in one of these next 3 buckets can have on you that I'm really wanting to help you recognize and see that you might be in one of these buckets, and then give you the tools and the steps to be able to help you shift and transition into a more like stable and long-term bucket. So these next 3 buckets are ones that some people might stay in for their whole lives, or they might be like transitional phases where they have experienced this, that, or the other. It's put them in this like transition type bucket, and they're working towards one of these other buckets that's a little bit more long-term, like being a believer or choosing to be a non-believer or an atheist. Okay, so the first of these 3 rarely talked about buckets is what I call a religious exile. A religious exile is somebody who was a believer, maybe was raised with a religion or a belief system that they and their family was pretty congruent with, but that has become a questioner. And what I mean by that is they maybe don't feel as in alignment with the belief system or the religion that they were raised with or that they were trying out. It doesn't necessarily mean that you had to be raised with something, but maybe if you got introduced to Christianity, when you were a teenager or in your early 20s or whenever in your life that it happened, and you were in that faith or in that belief system, and then you come to this point where it's like, whoa, wait a second. I've got more questions. This maybe isn't all adding up for me. I'm not sure that I'm feeling super congruent with this. I feel like I have, other things that I need answers to, that this box that I am in right now of this religion or this belief system is not allowing me to have access to, right? So these people find themselves being in like a teeter-totter where they're like, well, I still kind of go to church and I believe in this, like I've chosen this, or I was raised with this and I believe in this, but I also am like feeling really pulled and drawn to like these other ideas or these other beliefs that don't fit in with this one that I know so well and that's been ingrained in me. And now I'm confused. And now I'm like, I don't know, I believe in like the power of stones, and I really want to like use tarot cards to help me, or I want to see a psychic or a spiritual medium, but like that's not in alignment with some of my spiritual and religious beliefs. What do I do? These people really have this experience that they don't fit in anywhere, and that maybe there's this kind of internal judgment or internal fear that they're doing something wrong, or that they shouldn't be thinking about or exploring some of these other topics or beliefs. These people, I call them religious exiles because these folks have either by choice kind of separated themselves from their original belief system, and they're kind of lost in like no man's land when it comes to beliefs, or it happened just by happenstance. Like maybe they went to an event and had an experience that was more of like a spiritual experience, or did a meditation or something that was not in full alignment with their religion that they know so well and that they love and feel good with, but that this experience was so undeniable that they couldn't rationalize it, they couldn't assimilate, and they couldn't reconcile. Okay, these people really, really need reconciliation between what they used to believe and what they are believing now. Okay, religious exiles. That's bucket number 4 technically, but the first one of these 3 more rarely discussed buckets. Bucket number 2 or 5, however you're thinking about it, is what I call religious survivors. Religious survivors have been hurt, wronged, or betrayed by their belief system, by people in their belief system, or to some, by their literal higher power. They are angry with God. They feel like they have been so mistreated and abused, something bad has happened to them, or maybe multiple bad things have happened to them. Again, either by proxy of that belief system. It doesn't mean that they were in that belief system, but it could have been from people who had that belief system that then hurt them. And so instead of being upset with that individual person, they are upset with the belief system that that person holds. They feel like they have been either betrayed, like I said, or wronged by God itself, that somehow God has, fallen short or has not been there for them in certain ways, or has left when they needed them the most, or that they're seeing that the religion or the belief system through which they think God is coming through is hurting them, or is wrong, or has wronged them in some way, right? So I call them religious survivors because they're in need of a lot of reconciliation as well, just like religious exiles, but even more deeply, like they're in need of healing. They have wounds, they have scars, they have been in what I would maybe consider like a spiritual battle. And again, whether it's the people that have represented a certain belief system, or it's the belief system itself, or how they're perceiving or projecting onto the belief system, something has hurt them. And regardless if anyone thinks that that's real or not, their experience is real. I have been in all 3 of these buckets that I'm talking about with you, but I started as a religious survivor. I was actually raised Catholic, and I also had these skills that were just innate to myself that I didn't go out and try to develop. I didn't go out and try to make myself be a certain way. But as a kid, I was able to see, feel, and hear energy and what you would consider as being like ghosts or people that have passed away. I could see shadow figures. I was acquainted with demonic energy and those types of beings very, very early on at a very young age. I was attacked a lot by these kinds of energies. I had a lot of spiritual trauma. And then on top of that, because I was raised Catholic, by no fault of my parents' own or of technically the religion itself, I had people say that I was the devil, that I was going to hell, that I was bad and wrong just for being innately who I was. Like, it wasn't my fault. I didn't ask for this to happen. I didn't ask to be who I was. I just was. And then I just felt punished for it over and over and over again. And I eventually developed such a hatred towards God and Jesus and Catholicism and everybody that was in it and everybody that represented it, that I wanted absolutely nothing to do with any of them. I really wanted a safe space to feel like I could just be who I was and that wasn't wrong. And in my adulthood, I had more continual experiences of this religious trauma that would keep repeating itself, where even though I had attempted to shift into being a believer again, which in one of my story podcast episodes, you'll be able to hear about this, I had shifted in and out of being a believer, but some of those like religious survivor wounds kept coming to play. And I would have people that would remind me that, oh, like you have an intuition, like you're a medium, you are kind of psychic, like that's evil. That is the devil, and that's very unsafe. And I had such a bad taste in my mouth. I had a chip on my shoulder, and people that are religious survivors, they would tell you that they have experienced this. They've had trauma either as a kid or as an adult that they have just felt so wronged, betrayed, and hurt by their belief system or their religion. It took me a very, very long time to heal my religious survivor wounds and to really, really overcome the fact that I thought that I was evil just innately, that the beingness of who I was bad and wrong and evil, and that I shouldn't use any of my natural skill sets or talents for good to help anybody because they were just wrong, period. Like there was no black or white, or there was no gray area or in between. It was just, nope, this is wrong, you're wrong, who you are innately is wrong. And yeah, I mean, anybody who has that experience would naturally develop a chip on their shoulder. So if this is you, or if you can resonate with this type of example, or if you have an example of your own, I would probably fit you in the religious survivor bucket. Okay, the third or sixth and final bucket that I think is rarely talked about, that we need to be talking about more, is what I call soul seekers. Soul seekers are people who didn't necessarily grow up with a belief system, or they don't know what to believe, but they crave a deeper connection with themselves and or a higher power. I have a couple of clients that come to mind off the top of my head that I would say fit into the soul seeker bucket. One in particular, she was raised a little bit more secularized. Her family, like past generation family, had kind of a belief system, but she wasn't technically raised with one. I believe that she was second generation to the US, and her idea of things like higher power and religion and what to believe in is very malleable because she wasn't raised with anything. She didn't, have an idea of Jesus or of, the Buddha's teachings or even of the Bible. I refer a lot more to like the Judeo-Christian religion because that's the one I'm most familiar with. But, I'm speaking to all people who have all different types of belief systems, but she wasn't raised with anything. So she has had a little bit of a harder time in life, either fitting into different communities or groups and or feeling like she belongs anywhere. And this soul seeker person would, in my opinion, resonate with that feeling of being a lost or lonely soul, because if you fit into a bucket that's maybe outside of the soul seekers, this one feels like a transitionary bucket, because if you fit into any of the other buckets that's like a believer or a chosen non-believer or an atheist, that feels more certain and more stable and like a standard. But when you're a soul seeker, you're just kind of floating up in the air like a bubble, and you're not really sure where you're going or what to believe. Like I said, they crave a connection to their higher power, but they don't have any association to what that higher power is. They maybe have learned about some things throughout their path and throughout their life, but it's not something that's like truly and deeply resonated with their core, right? They are really needing, wanting, and craving to have that connection with themselves, to, if they're more spiritually inclined, to have a connection to that higher power, and to stop feeling like they're in limbo, to just really feel like they're congruent with something, that they feel heard and seen and supported, understood, unconditionally loved. I would say that that's one of the benefits that like a Christian believer has that a lot of these other buckets don't have, that I've noticed just as observation, that a Christian believer has a very congruent, well, depending on the spectrum of Christian believer, some of the ones that I've encountered have a very congruent, deeply, deeply unconscious belief that they are unconditionally loved, they are supported, they are saved, they have something that they can go to that will love them and be there for them always, no matter what. That's a very, very powerful belief. Whether you believe that that could be real or could happen, that's a very powerful belief. And a lot of these other buckets, they lack that belief. And I'm not saying that that's, bad or wrong, but it is in some ways a disadvantage, because by having that belief, in a lot of ways, it does make you a strong person. It makes you very resilient. It makes you very interdependent. It creates healthier relationships and ways to cope with the difficulty of life and with suffering and pain and all of that. So the soul seeker, I would say, like, their deepest desire is to have this place that feels comforting, that feels like home, whether it's in themselves or it's in this belief of higher power or both, to be able to be connected to both. Okay, so religious exiles, they don't have a chip on their shoulder. They don't have a bad taste in their mouth of religion. They are just questioning a lot of things and kind of feeling in limbo as well, teeter-tottering, not knowing like where they fit in and which direction to go and what they really believe. And there's a lot of confusion. Religious survivors have a chip on their shoulder. They have a really bad taste in their mouth. They've been hurt, wronged, and betrayed, and they need a lot of healing. They need a deep, deep cleanse and a reassociation to religion and beliefs and spirituality in general. Like that's a very deep cut when you are a religious survivor. It's a deep, deep cut, and I know I've had it. And then soul seekers, they don't necessarily have wounds per se. They are just floating around, and they're a little bit more lost and lonely and don't have the answers. They don't have that congruency of that they believe that there's this solid thing or presence that loves them unconditionally, that will always be there for them, that is their family, that they can rely on and turn to in hard times, and that will help get them through their suffering and pain if ever they do, or that is there in celebration with them through their triumphs. All of these different buckets, there may even be more. This has just come to me in my the way that I am and like my downloads and how I'm attempting to help people that exist in these 3 less talked about buckets. But if you're feeling resonant with any and or multiple of these buckets that I've discussed, even if they're the first 3 or if they're the last 3, then I would deeply encourage you to go look for the podcast episode that is specifically for your bucket and really allow the information to like wash over you and settle in. And like, if it really resonates with you, then I would suggest taking the steps that are in each of those so that you can get closer to yourself. You can come home and be more congruent with yourself and what you really believe. I'm not here to force you to believe anything, to be like, this is the way, this is how everything needs to be. This is like, it's just, that's not who I am. In some ways, I kind of wish that I was, because maybe that'd be easier. Like I said, the believers, the Christian believers that I've come across that are that way, that it's like, this is the way, the truth, and the life. Like Jesus Christ is the way. He has, died and risen for our sins. And they're just like so in that. I admire that. I have had to accept that I'm a person that is just not as much that, because I love to question things. But there's a benefit to that, because I'm here to help you all who also don't have that like congruency, I'm a believer type of attitude. Again, everyone, I accept you all, I love you all, I respect you all, but I'm just really trying to help those that are more of lost and lonely souls. So go check out each of those individual episodes. They should be labeled with each little bucket, and see if that can support you on your path and on your journey. I am sending so much love and healing to you if you are a religious survivor, and lots of grace for you going through this path and this journey. I hope that this episode has been really, really insightful and at least helpful for you to feel seen, heard, and supported in ways that maybe you've never been before. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next one.